Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thanks so much for joining this call on the Electoral Count Act. I'm Richard Idlin, the National Policy Director for Business for America, and we're really happy to have you all here today for what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. Just by way of quick background, Business for America is a 3.5-year-old nonpartisan not-for-profit. We have a C3 and a C4. And our purpose is to educate and mobilize businesses across the country to work on nonpartisan political reform in an effort to support a healthy democracy. And we work on a variety of issues, including voting rights, election cybersecurity, ranked choice voting, and focus also on encouraging companies to help play a role in reducing polarization and combating mis and disinformation. And ultimately, our objective is for companies to play an active role in civic life and help maintain our democratic institutions and a safe and secure election system. We believe that companies can, in fact, play a constructive role in our democratic institution, our democratic life, and that is very much a part of our work. This year, we've been spending a lot of time supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We're co-leading a national effort called Business for Voting Rights, and are also working on some election security projects. One of those is with our a partner organization of ours, the National Election Defense Coalition, and we thank them and Ben Zion Potasnik, the founder of that organization, who's also worked with Protect Democracy. So briefly, the purpose of this webinar is to give the business community a better understanding of the Electoral Count Act. It's a fairly obscure 130-year-old law, but we all learned a lot about it on January 6th. And it's our belief that part of the confusion and some of the reasons for the insurrection on that day were caused by maybe an unintentional misunderstanding of the parameters of the law. There may have also been some intentional efforts to misread the objectives and parameters of that 130-year-old law. And just quickly, the Electoral Count Act of 1887 sets the timeline for states to appoint presidential electors in November and for electors to cast their votes in December, and then describes the process that Congress should follow when it counts the state's electoral votes in January, and finally explains how Congress should resolve any disputes about what slate of electors would be seated. And as you may remember, there was a good bit of confusion over what the vice president's role was on that day. So what's key, we think, for a prosperous and sustainable economy is to have clear rules that don't benefit one party or another, and rules that are well understood and are adhered to. So the rule of law is really essential, we believe, in a well-functioning economy and a stable democracy. So without further ado, let me just briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll get to it. So our first panelist is Rachel Kleinfeld, and Rachel is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program within the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And at the endowment, Rachel focuses on issues of rule of law, national security, and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transition. She is also the founding CEO of the Truman National Security Project, which, as you might know, is a movement of national security, political, and military leaders working to promote a secure and stable democracy. Following Rachel will be Genevieve Nadal, and Genevieve is a counsel with the nonpartisan not-profit Protect Democracy organization. She is also active and is a part of the National Task Force on Election Crises, of which Rachel is also part of and Trey is part of. And Geneviève will tell us more about the important work of the National Task Force on Election Crises. Prior to joining Protect Democracy, Geneviève served in the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General for over 7 years. And then finally, we have Trey Grayson. Trey is the former Secretary of State from Kentucky, where he served in office from November of 2003 to November of 2010. He is a former president of the National Association of Secretaries of State and the former chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Association. And he's also affiliated with the National Task Force on Election Crises. So again, thank you all for joining. And Rachel, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. And thank you for joining the webinar and for joining BFA. It's really incredibly important. I realize this law is obscure and it's kind of buried, but when the plumbing in your house has a leak, it's a big problem. And it's often a bigger problem when the line is buried. And that's sort of the situation we're in here. So I want to make 3 points. I'm going to make the first 2 up front, and the third you can ask me about, or Richard can ask me about later. The first is that democracies really are at risk, including ours. This is happening around the world, and it's not scaremongering. It's a very serious problem. The second is that foreign and hostile nations are assisting our own chaos, and they're using these periods of crisis. And we're seeing this around the world, and we're seeing this in our own country. And the third is that this kind of geopolitical instability is bad for our country. It's also extremely bad for businesses. And you can see this in GDP numbers. You can see this in hostile takeovers of business and personalized governance and what happens to businesses in those countries. That third one I'll touch on if you want to ask me about it. But first, democracy has been in recession worldwide for nearly 15 years now. I'm on the board of Freedom House, and you can check the Freedom House numbers, but you can check a whole lot of others. The majority of democracies today die not through coups, not through wars, but by elected leaders with undemocratic tendencies that slowly alter the rules of the game. That's the story of Hungary. That's the story of Turkey, who's another NATO member. It's also the story of India, which just got downgraded to partly free in Freedom House's rankings. And India is the world's largest democracy, of course, and one quite similar to ours. So that means what happens is this slow boil. It's not a sudden coup with rolling tanks. It can be really hard to recognize because it's these small changes to boring laws like this one. And in fact, business leaders sometimes welcome some of these small changes. In India, for instance, Modi's government was really welcomed by business leaders. They thought he would be pro-business, and then they got quite a comeuppance. And countries with presidential majoritarian systems like ours are particularly at risk. Only 5 countries have maintained continuous democracies for the last 50 years if they had presidential majoritarian systems like ours. There's all sorts of reasons for that I can get into, but it's a particularly problematic form of government. And it's not a question of whether we're going to have another disputed election. We're a 50-50 country. We're having disputed close elections all the time at the state level, and at the national level, it's just extraordinarily likely that the next one will be very close and the one after that. And this damage is compounding. So the need to improve the rules is very close. And this has real national security and geopolitical instability ramifications. Transitions and the immediate aftermath of transitions are always periods of really high vulnerability for our country. So Gore-Bush, the disputed election, you might all remember 2000 and the hanging chads and so on, that slowed the appointment of senior officials. And the 9/11 Commission later on blamed that slow appointment of senior officials as a major contributing factor to getting blindsided on 9/11. The leading principals had only just been appointed and met about al-Qaeda September 4th, just the week before September 11th, because they'd just been appointed. Because of that, Bush really was worried about his own transition and wanted to have this gold standard transition. And that was necessary because there was a very real terrorist threat on the mall the day of Obama's inauguration. And the national security leaders of Bush and the incoming President Obama met in the security room, the Situation Room, the morning of the inauguration to coordinate security during the inauguration because it was such a real threat. The threat did not come to be. But it got the presidential leaders in the practice of hosting emergency preparedness exercises between outgoing and incoming administrations, because we'd gotten used to the problem of things like North Korea launching ballistic missiles. They have a tendency to do that. Trump, they did it on the 23rd day of his administration. Obama on the 75th day of his administration. North Korea just has a tendency of liking to do that. The global pandemic, of course, started right after Trump took office. That wasn't a malevolent actor, that was more of a malignant actor, we hope, although, you know, we still don't really know how that got started. But these things happen right away after you have a new president, and you have a lot of things that have to happen during that transition time. You've got 10 weeks between election and inauguration, just 10 weeks. And if you think about one person in your business going on maternity leave, think about what has to happen. There are 4,000 political jobs that change hands. Many of them require security clearances and background checks that take weeks to months. The president and key officials receive daily or near daily classified briefings. 1,200 positions require Senate confirmation. Those Senate confirmations often require full FBI field investigations. My father's an appellate court judge at the federal level. I remember what a full FBI field investigation requires. It's a gigantic undertaking. It takes months and complete financial disclosures of things that you do not remember. So that's 60 agencies preparing 300 individuals, landing teams coming to hand over information. Slowing that process down by having a disputed transition leaves our nation in a lot of danger. And we're not the only ones that are watching, of course. Other countries are watching, and they watched the last one and they saw what was happening. So China, for instance, imposed this new national security law on Hong Kong in June during a racial unrest, but they didn't use it until December. And in December, during our post-election chaos, that's when they cracked down on Hong Kong and decided to take over against the treaty with Britain, because they knew that we couldn't do anything and that we wouldn't back Britain if Britain tried to do anything. Next time it might be Taiwan. We have a treaty obligation with Taiwan. What happens if we don't follow that treaty obligation? What happens to the relationship with China? Both Russia and China really are taking glee in anything that's making their autocratic systems look better and less chaotic than our democratic system. Now, Biden's already issued an order to Russia to step down its cyber hackers. Russia is somewhat famous in the national security community for having private cyber hackers that act on their own behalf, but with the wink and a nod from the public authorities. And they take down critical infrastructure and hold it ransom. So hostage, oil infrastructure, hospitals, small businesses. I'm sure many of your businesses are well aware of this problem. They might choose that time to add to the chaos, knowing that we have a transition that's in chaos and can't help businesses, can't issue threats, can't use our intelligence networks to do anything to help our private sector. So there are real business implications of global instability and market uncertainty that gets caused when we have this problem. And I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk further about what this kind of problem causes, but we can get into the nuts and bolts of the law now.
Great. Rachel, thank you. Let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. So, given the threats and risks you've identified to the economy and to businesses, what recommendation could you offer to the private sector as far as supporting an orderly, peaceful transition?
I mean, I think we need to amend the Electoral Count Act and make it just really clear. That's at the beginning of my career when I was working on rule of law and legal reform, we argued for bright line laws in countries that had a lot of polarization. You wanted laws that it didn't matter whose side you were on. They were very easy to interpret. And that's what we need here. This Electoral Count Act was written in the aftermath of Reconstruction when there was a lot of reason to make it very murky. We don't need that right now. The other thing is, I hear you work on ranked choice voting. There's a lot of reason to think that we need to move our election system away from the extremes that we're getting right now and depolarize. And I think ranked choice and other majority voting systems that could work us toward majorities rather than pluralities of voters electing leaders is a longer term solution after we get past this hurdle, but yes, this comes first.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let's deal with the immediacy. Genevieve, if you would help us better understand what the Electoral Count Act entails and why Protect Democracy feels so strongly about the need to reform it.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. And I'll pick up right where Rachel left off. And she's absolutely right about the history of the, I'm going to say ECA, it's a little easier about the ECA, right? It's written in 1887. It took Congress at the time 10 years to put it together, but it was really born out of a crisis. So for the history buffs out there, it was the Hayes-Tilden election, probably our most heavily contested election in American history, at least until recently. And it came at a time when there was the 12th Amendment, but there was no instruction for Congress on what to do when there are real disputes about how to count or if to count a state's results. And it sort of operated in the background for many years with occasional flare-ups here and there, but we've been actually pretty lucky as a country. But the last election really sort of laid bare some of the vulnerabilities in the statute, and that are important for all the reasons that Rachel said. Just as a sort of introductory point, I'm going to sort of highlight the ways in which it most critically needs to be updated. But everything that we need to do to the statute really is consistent with the intent behind it, right? You can update the statute without dramatically changing the way we elect presidents in the United States, for example. And it's really all about avoiding crisis. There are lots of other things we could talk about in terms of our political system and voting and all of that, but the ECA can really be a sort of technical fix. It's not often maybe you have people come on and make a pitch about how boring something is and to really embrace the sort of technocratic boringness of a thing, but that's what this is and really should be. And so let me sort of walk through what needs to be fixed, right? So the statute, as you said, Richard, sets the process and the timing for electing presidents, right? So one of the first things that it does is sort of set the election day, right? It's Congress's authority to say when the election should occur. And really what that means is when electors should be appointed, right? But in our country now, for the last century or more, we choose presidents through popular elections, right? So it sets election day. There's some very vague language in the statute alluding to the fact that states might hold an election and that election might fail. And then what happens after that? And we saw that come up in the months sort of like leading up to and right after the election. Pretty important piece of a statute not to have any sort of definition or anything around it. So one thing that really needs to be fixed is that piece. And it should make very clear what happens if, in an extraordinary circumstance like a terrorist attack or a large natural disaster, if elections can't be completed on election day, right? So that's not an opportunity for state legislatures, for example, to step in and change the results of the election or whatnot, but really limited to extreme circumstances. So that's one piece I would say needs to be fixed. The other, the ECA was designed really to privilege state conduct of elections and state level determinations of the outcome and resolution of any disputes. So the timing in which states, do that should be absolutely clear. And this mechanism in this current statute that says, if a state conducts an election, if it resolves any disputes under existing law, and it does so by a certain date, then Congress, the members of Congress are supposed to just count that, right? It's supposed to be conclusive, the state's determination. There could be some more teeth around that. Third, you alluded to the vice president's role. That obviously became a flashpoint, and we're hearing a lot more about that in the news in recent weeks. So hard to ignore that piece of it. Historically, the vice president's role as president of the Senate, so it's almost always the vice president, but not always, is really supposed to be a pretty ceremonial or ministerial role, right? Sort of opening up the certificates and presenting them to the chambers of Congress to count. So to avoid some of the incredible pressure and confusion and the like that we saw in January, really making very clear what the vice president's role is and is not is going to be critical going forward. Objections, that's right. We saw again in January this issue of objecting members of Congress to another state's election results, right? There's a lot that can be fixed there. The statute was not meant to allow Congress to second guess the results of an election from states, but really to preserve the ability to object in very extreme circumstances or on really technical points. So I think there are a couple of things that can be fixed here. One is to just make it harder for Congress to lodge objections, right? Right now, it only takes one member of each chamber to object to any state's election results. And And that requires then a whole process, right? The chambers have to split apart, they debate, they vote. It can be very disruptive. So I would suggest raising that threshold to a higher number. It could be a quarter, it could be a third, maybe not an issue of science there, but something much more meaningful that requires a larger portion of Congress to be on board with that. And then again, clarity. A lot of this is just about clarity. When is it appropriate for a member of Congress to object to a state's electoral votes, and when is it not? Making that absolutely clear. The statute has really muddled language right now. Again, there's an intent behind it, but there's a difference sometimes between intent and what appears on paper, and what appears on paper could be much more clear. Then again, with respect to objections, making it a little bit harder, but also making it clear what's appropriate and what's not, to avoid, again, misunderstanding, miscommunication, and in the extreme, sort of exploitation. And then last, sort of, if all else fails and we nonetheless get to a point, which we've not seen in quite some time, but we get to a point where the chambers of Congress really just disagree on what to do about a state's votes, right? Whether to count, or if to count, and which one to count if there's more than one. The law, that's sort of where we're at the height of constitutional crisis, right? Where the outcome of a presidential election is unclear and Congress is deadlocked or in dispute. There should be, of all the places and all the times you want there to be very clear rules, that should absolutely be one. And right now the statute is a bit muddled. And so making it whatever, there's different ways to do it, but it should be absolutely clear what happens and what prevails under different circumstances. So those are some, like I said, sort of boring, very technical, but fixes that could have significant impact in avoiding a crisis going forward. And I'll just say that, you mentioned the National Task Force on Election Crises. The task force issued a paper outlining roughly what I just explained just a few weeks ago. And that's a bipartisan task force. It's a multidisciplinary task force. It's not alone in thinking that these fixes are a good idea. There's actually a lot of support across ideologies and across disciplines for fixing and updating the statute in this way. So I just make the strong pitch that these are very feasible fixes that really, like I said, technical, but really can have a significant impact in sort of shoring up our system of electing presidents and preserving that transition time for all the reasons that Rachel said.
Great. Genevieve, thank you. What provisions are there within the law that would allow a state to have competing slates of electors? And, that's something that obviously, there's a lot of concern going into 24 around, which would certainly increase political instability and create further risks of the type that Rachel described.
Well, I would say that there isn't really a provision in the law that allows that to happen. It's not supposed to happen. If that has happened, it's something that's probably gone pretty wrong along the way. What the statute does provide for is, should that happen, how Congress should sort it out, right? So that what the statute is pretty clear, but and can be much more clear about states determining their election results, right? Every state has recount processes, contest processes, and ways to resolve any election disputes, and to do that in a relatively timely fashion. And then Congress is just supposed to count those, right? We haven't seen actually competing slates of electors, I think, since the 1800s. Because the reality of what happened in 2020 and January 2021 is that there were not competing slates of electors, not really, not two slates coming from a state authority of any kind. Mm-hmm. So the law sort of is about protecting against crisis and defining what should happen in certain eventualities, but it's not meant to invite that sort of problem.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, folks, for writing questions in here. I will get to those as best as we can. Let's turn over to Trey Grayson. So Trey, you've had the insider's advantage of understanding how states run their elections. And so I'm curious if you could give us a perspective of why these reforms would be beneficial to an orderly process state by state, and how this benefits the political system.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. It's good to be with everybody. This is not a fake background. I'm outside, and I didn't even know there were two American flags over my shoulder, which is perfect for this conversation. And as you can tell, the clouds and the sun are going to be coming in and out. I'm visiting my daughter at her college this weekend and doing this outside. So it's great to be with everybody. Yeah, I actually, when I was secretary, I presided over 2 electoral college meetings in Kentucky, 2004 and 2008. And they were very ceremonial affairs, and we passed along without controversy our slate of electors to Congress in both instances. Those 2 elections were rather boring elections compared to what we saw last year and compared to 2000, and actually, and even to a lesser extent, 2016. I think one thing you got to think about from an election administration standpoint, and both of my predecessors on this panel alluded to this a little bit, but we have a very decentralized system of election administration. Congress does pass laws on occasion that set usually floors. You have to do at least this, but then states are left to their own, to be able to operate within that. There's safeguards, certainly, that the courts, there's recounts and audits, not the kinds of audits we've seen in the news a lot over the last couple of months, but the kinds of audits that take place right after an election to confirm an outcome. But there's a whole lot of procedures, but states do vary. And the election administrators are really critical in that. While I was a partisan elected official, and while Kentucky elections are administered by the leader of each county is a county clerk who is a partisan elected official, we bake bipartisanship into this entire process at every level. In every room, there's Democrats and Republicans, and opportunities for the media and candidates to oversee counts, to make decisions, for the press to cover it, and for the courts to hear challenges, to clarify rules in advance of election day or after election day if we didn't have time to clarify all those rules. And the idea is that we can have confidence that the person who gets the most votes at the ballot box or in the electoral college meeting gets to take office in the next term, and the person whose term expires leaves office at that time. Election administrators work incredibly hard so that you don't read about themselves in the news. We don't want to be in the news. We want the issues and the candidates to be the things that we're talking about. And most election administrators at the local level are just really proud to be able to do all that. One of the challenges with a flawed Electoral Count Act, or ECA, is that, for example, if some of the strategies and tactics that have been discussed by the Trump campaign had been followed, it basically would have said to all the election administrators all across the country, it really didn't matter what you did. We don't care about all the effort you took, the painstaking effort you took to execute this, to follow the laws passed by state legislators, to make sure that the person with the most votes wins the election. We're just going to substitute our own judgment, and that would be demoralizing in the short run. It would probably cause more folks to engage, to start being involved in that practice for the wrong reasons, and it would cause some of our great professionals to step aside. Having that competence of election administrators is really critical. We can always, they ought to be observed, and there ought to be post-election analyses and things like that. But that process, letting the administrators administer those elections, is a really key bedrock principle, and it's important for the country. Rachel talked a lot about some of the challenges in other countries. I think about right now, we're talking about the potential risk of not default because we don't raise the debt ceiling in time, and that Congress isn't able to pay that. And as a country, as businesses, we generally think that that's not possible. So we don't price that risk in. Bankers don't price that risk into the interest rates that they charge. Business owners don't price that risk into the cost of goods sold. And customers, therefore, don't have to pay that risk premium because we expect our government to pay the bills. And that's not a given across the country. Well, if all of a sudden it's no longer a given that the terms of office end when they're supposed to end, and the people who get the most votes are supposed to take office, you have to price in a political risk into that. That's a destabilizing feature for our free enterprise system. So there really is this great connection, important connection, between democracy and free enterprise, and having, advocating for some of the tweaks that we're talking about today to clarify this law, which is really basically supposed to just cause Congress. Here's how you count it. I think one other thing to keep in mind is when this law was passed, it took weeks to bring the votes to Washington, and communication didn't happen very well. So we now know instantly, we know on in December when the electors meet, we know the results. We wait till January 6th because that's what the law and the history and everything says. But we knew the electoral college count, and the reality is we knew the electoral college count several weeks before that in almost every state. There are a few states that we had to go through some court challenges, and that's good that we have that month to work things out. Maybe there were problems that need to be addressed through court challenges or through recounts and things like that. But a lot of the rationale that motivated the ECA in the first place is gone because of the instantaneous communication and the ease of transportation in the world in which we live now. So I'm excited that so many folks logged on today to learn about this. It is definitely not a sexy topic, to be honest. I had never thought about Electoral College Act, even though we followed it when I was in office. And I remember when we started talking about it on the task force last summer, I don't think any of us, in our heart of hearts, we probably didn't think we would ultimately have to see what happened on January 6th and some of the challenges. We survived it, but now is a good time to fix it so we don't have to face those challenges in 4 years from now.
Right. Yeah. Well, January 6th proved to be quite a wake-up call in many ways. Trey, let me ask you, because there are a few questions here, sort of a similar theme about is the state government able to change the count of the electoral votes? And the other part of the question is, I really want to emphasize that, or get your opinion on, does one party benefit from this change? Or is this a, clearly nonpartisan initiative that helps to stabilize the process, regardless of who's the winner and who's the loser?
Well, let me do the second one first, because I honestly think that's maybe the more important of the two, given the fact we're trying to get a reform through Congress. And to get things through Congress, you either have to get both parties to sign on, at least in some capacity, or a big change to a fundamental rule like the filibuster in the Senate. This is why this is the perfect time to do it. I mean, we are far enough away from the November 2024 election. We honestly don't even know. Normally, you assume presidents of their part will be nominated by their own party for re-election, but let's face it. I think given President Biden's age, there's a question about. I don't think anybody believes it's an automatic slam dunk that he would run for re-election, even if he has a successful tenure. So we don't even know with certainty who the Democratic nominee is going to be. There's a lot of belief that former President Trump might run again, but again, that's a long time from now, and he's no spring chicken either, and has some challenges. He may not even run. So we don't know who the nominees are going to be. I think that's important because we live in a political world. And so when we're changing the rules in elections, having that level of uncertainty is helpful. I think from a Republican standpoint, I look at this and say, okay, there was a lot of pressure on Vice President Pence to violate the plain meaning of the ECA. And he withstood that pressure. I'm actually reading Peril, the Woodward Costa book that just came out a few days ago, and that we've been reading about some of the excerpts from that book. I encourage you to read the book. I just literally finished the part about the ECA and the challenges. And Vice President Pence he withstood a lot of pressure from President Trump and others. Well, as a Republican, guess who the vice president is now? It's Vice President Kamala Harris. And so if I'm a Republican, I hope that she can withstand that pressure too, but now they're in control. We also don't know, going back to the uncertainty, we don't know who's going to be in control of Congress. I mean, the Republicans benefited from controlling a majority of the states in the state legislature or of the congressional delegations. Who knows what that's going to be in a few years from now. So this isn't the rules changing. The changes we're talking about are clarifications. They don't favor one party over another. They favor democracy. And it really is a good time to do it. Now, the challenge, I think that why it's so hard right now is there's a lot of raw nerves, a lot of raw feelings from last time. And there is the specter of Trump over the Republican Party. And I don't know that anybody's asked him necessarily about electoral count reform, ECA reform. There may be a fear by some Republicans that this would be viewed as a slap at him. And he may also think that this was a tool to overcome a lawfully conducted election. But if you just look at the makeup, the potential role reversal with the Democrats holding the vice president's office, to me, it strikes me that Republicans ought to sign on to this. Now, to the first question about being able to change vote totals, I mean, there are state laws. They're supposed to be in place before the election, and we do have procedures for the losers to challenge, sometimes automatically. If it's a close enough election, some states automatically call for audits or recounts. or a recanvass, which is basically counting again. States have those processes. You can go to court. So there are things you can do, but the idea is to do all that before the certification date. And once that certification date happens, then that certification has been performed under state law, then Congress isn't supposed to change it. The state's not supposed to change it, but they have that roughly month to do it. And, that's where the timetable of the ECA is to give that time period for that to happen. The other thing that sort of happens unofficially, normally, this didn't happen in 2021, but I've seen it happen in other races, is that also allows for a little bit of a cooling off period. Campaigns peak on election day, voters' emotions peak on election day and a little bit of the day after. And so if there's some questions about an election that was close, but somebody wins, sometimes just a passage of a few days or a few weeks causes people to settle down and understand that, okay, really, I may not have been happy with the outcome, but I'm not as fired up about it. I'm not as emotional about it. And that traditionally happens in elections. So we have this, not only the safeguards, but we just have the passage of time. And, that didn't happen in 2021, which again is all the more reason to fix all these challenges that this ECA has.
Okay, great. Thank you, Trey. Rachel, let me bring you back in because I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent German election, just quickly, and sort of there is a large industrial, advanced industrial democracy, complicated political system. They seem to have pulled off a fairly successful election, close. And is there anything that we might learn about managing political risk and having a orderly transition of power from that country or other countries you studied?
It's funny, I remember in 2000, I was actually in England during the 2000 election. And I remember when it happened, we stayed up all night. Everybody stayed up all night to see what was going on. And saying to everyone, gosh, here it is, the most powerful job in the most powerful country in the world. In 2000, America was just unchallenged. And there are no tanks on the street. No one's talking about a military takeover. There is no violence. It's an amazing feat to have an election that's being decided by, I think it was 544 votes, and to have everyone just accept the Supreme Court's ruling and move on. And everyone looked at me like I was insane. Nobody would have expected any of those things from the United States. And so to talk about their absence seemed crazy because of course they were absent in the United States. Now there's no of course to any of that, I think. And so it's worth looking at Germany and seeing, well, of course, Germany just had an orderly transition of power in a very close election. And so, that's how it's supposed to be. But there are some reasons for that. I mean, what we know about comparative democracy is that multi-party systems do much better with polarization. America has three things against it structurally, four actually. The presidential majoritarian system, as I said before, is a real problem. Juan Lintz, the leader of democracy studies, says when you have that problem of Congress and the president being from separate parties, you have two groups that are equally elected to represent the will of the people, and it can be really hard to determine who has the will of the people. Dual party systems tend toward polarization. They tend toward us-them dynamics. So two-party systems just tend toward this severe polarization. And when you have sorted parties, the way that ours are, where your identity is wrapped up in your party because so many other characteristics fall along these same lines, it gets more and more us-them. And that's what we're facing right now. We have primaries which supercharge extremism in our country. The primary dynamics, the fear of being primaried, means that a very small group of voters can hijack whole political parties. So if you're not going to cross party lines and vote for the other side because your parties are so sorted, your identity is so wrapped up, then you're letting 5-10% of the voters in some primaries determine who your choice is going to be. So Madison Cawthorn was elected with, I think, 5.4% of the primary field. Marilyn Taylor Greene had just over 10%. The most extreme leaders are getting these tiny percentages in mixed primary fields and multiple primary fields. So what you would look for in a country like Germany is the representation. One thing we know is that more representation of voters, even of voters with extreme views, actually tends to just calm people down. They want to see themselves represented. They want to see their views represented, and then they can kind of take a deep breath. and say, okay, democracy is working. I see somebody like me up there. When they keep getting blocked out over and over and over, the way that we blocked out, Ross Perot got almost a fifth of the votes. You don't see anyone like Ross Perot for 20, 30 years. So would you have a two-party system where you just can't get a voice? It pushes people toward more and more extremes for longer and longer. So that's why things like ranked choice voting and other forms of voting reform are so important, because they let people get represented and they let the air out of the extremism at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Genevieve, there are a few questions about, the status of reforming the ECA, who's promoting this, whether there might be a constituency in Congress from both parties to support reform. Can you give us any sense of the forthcoming discussion?
Sure. So we haven't seen a bill introduced yet. I think we're hopeful actually that this is something that Congress can come together on in a bipartisan way. And groups like the National Task Force on Election Crises, Protect Democracy, and many of our partners, including Trey and Rachel, this is something we've been thinking about for a long time and working on since before the election, and having conversations on the Hill. And there's an interest there. There's, Trey sort of said it best about why there really is a bipartisan case to be made for updating the statute. And I rarely find myself like the optimist on a call like this, but I do feel optimistic that there's something fundamentally different here, and there's both a strong case to be made for why not just Democrats but Republicans in Congress should get on board with updating the statute. But we're already seeing signs of that. So this is one area where if you sort of read literature, see who's writing about it, there's really cross-ideological support. So everything from Cato and National Review and the task force to other writers and thinkers further on the left, there's a pretty broad consensus, not only that the statute should be updated for everyone's benefit and sort of no one's advantage, I guess I would say, and roughly how to do that. So I'm optimistic that we can seize on that, and that there's a lot going on in Congress right now. Not only are there some real tensions, but plates are just very full. And so I think over time that there is real opportunity for this. And so I would encourage folks to be optimistic like I am about it, and to translate that into action. There's still real value to be added for example, the business community using its voice in public and in private to make the case on the Hill with Republicans, I would say in particular, as to why this is a good thing, for the business community, for our economy, for the members themselves and the like. So there are discussions being happening. I'm optimistic, but time will tell.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you, Trey. I'm going to ask you to comment on that in a moment, and just remind folks that Business for America's sort of mission is to educate the business community about these structural challenges that face our democracy, and then get you involved. So we will be following what the progress of the ECA is, and staying in close contact with Genevieve. And at the point at which there may be a bill, we will look to involve as many of you who are interested around that. Trey, so what else can you offer us as far as the future of this legislation? And also, why should businesses really, again, care about this issue?
I do think this is a good issue for business to be involved in. I saw one of the questions that somebody posted in the chat was a question about, how can businesses do this in sort of a non-political or nonpartisan way? And there are some aspects of reform of our election administration have unfortunately become a little bit partisan or ideological. I guess more partisan, less ideological. But I don't think this is one. Jean mentioned, Cato and National Review writing about this, and again coming to consensus on the issue. So I think that this is one where business can weigh in, and some business leaders should maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable weighing in on some things that appear to favor one side or another, or advance by one side or another. This is probably one in the democracy space that there should be more comfort about, and we talked about some of the reasons why. From a cynical Republican point of view, you might want to favor this. and as well as from a substance Republican point of view, and then the same on the Democratic side. One of my jobs that I had after leaving office, I ran a local chamber of commerce, and our chamber of commerce, I started this, and it's continued after I left, has really got concerned about voter participation in our community. It was low compared to other areas of Kentucky, and so they decided to get involved and do this. And we've seen businesses make a difference in policies that are not necessarily directly, in line with their sector or the kinds of things we think of with business issues like regulation and taxation and trade and things like that. We've seen more and more businesses weighing in, and they can make a difference. And I watch the business community in Georgia, for example, with some of the early versions of the elections bill that was passed in Georgia, which I recognize there's still some controversy and some concerns about. The early versions that moved would have caused a lot more controversy and a lot more questions had they passed. The business community engaged and shaped it. And I'll go back to something I talked about earlier and something that Rachel talked about earlier. Is the free enterprise system depends upon a stable democracy. We don't want to have risks. We don't want to have usually if you're less of a democratic country, you're going to have more corruption. That's bad for business. So there's a whole host of sort of economic or systemic reasons why it's good for businesses to engage in issues, and why it's important specifically to engage in helping to promote a democracy. A stable democracy is just good for business. And I'm happy to advocate and talk to any business leaders on here offline about how they could be engaged on this particular one.
12 hours.
Thank you, Trey. Rachel, when you think about, the perspective Trey just offered, and then again, you think about other advanced industrial economies that are democracies, what might businesses in the United States learn from their counterparts in the private sector in these other countries? Where have we seen the business community in India or in the UK or Germany or Australia or Canada step up and support the rule of law and the maintenance of democratic institutions?
Sure. So business plays an incredibly important role. They're probably the most important civil society actor in many countries outside of, say, the church in some parts of Latin America or so on. They, first of all, they have funds, so they can fund candidates and they can fund advertising and so on. But they also represent something. They represent stability. They represent jobs. They represent sort of the normal functioning of the capitalist economy. And that means something to a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who might otherwise be searching for stability in all the wrong places, as it were, when they're looking toward more authoritarian leaders and so on. So I think it's really important for business to say, no, stability lies in our democratic system, messy as it is. It doesn't lie in sort of the false hopes of authoritarianism. And you see businesses doing this in countries that have remained just on this side of the line. And where it hasn't worked, in places like Poland, which is slipping backward, or Hungary or India, where it hasn't worked, it's often that business sees a leader as a sort of false hope. They look at the policy promises of the leader rather than the character of the leader, and they say, "Oh, the policy promises sound good. We'll get on board," and they sort of bypass the authoritarian nature of the leader, and then they get caught by surprise. You see this in Peru under Fujimori, or Italy under Berlusconi, and right now in India with Modi. And what happens then is you get this personalization of politics, and it's the same thing whether it's left or right. You also see it in Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua and Venezuela. It really doesn't matter. It's the same process. What happens is the leader tends to make promises to businesses that stay on their side. They say, "Look, stay on my side and you'll get merger authorizations, you'll get duty-free tariffs, you'll get the things you want. But if you cross me, you'll get some tax harassment, you'll get regulatory harassment." They might not say that outright, but they show it in their actions. And so businesses learn that they need to obey, they need to stay on the right side of that leader. The problem is, first of all, that they might not want to just stay on the right side of their leader, and their customer base might not be doing those things. So their business interests might not be in sync with what the leader is wanting them to do, and that creates real problems for their actual bottom line. And that moves very, very quickly. That kind of personalization of politics, once it starts, business really can't get ahead of it. They need to get ahead of it before it starts.
Right. Thank you. So as we come to a close here, I just wanted to go back and look at the chat and the Q&A and note that the link to the report about the Electoral Count Act is now listed there. There's a hyperlink for that report. There's a question here about how can businesses engage locally and stay out of politics? And Trey, I'd like you to answer that, but I'll give my quick answer first, which is that, from Business for America's point of view, we think that election cybersecurity provisions, voting rights, these are not partisan issues. These are democratic with a small d issues that matter to everyone. And as we said in the beginning, the more people that participate in the political system tends to make it more stable. Trey, would you like to say anything about the staying out of politics question?
Yeah. And actually, I want to pick up on one of the concepts that was mentioned in this question is the local piece. There's one thing that's often forgotten when we talk about engaging Congress or even a state legislature for that matter, is elected officials, elected legislators care a great deal about what their constituents, about what their voters think. So if a business is in Kentucky or Ohio or Indiana or Washington State or whatever, reaching out to your own members of Congress, letting them know that this is on your radar screen, that this matters. There's going to be a national effort to engage in this at the appropriate time in Washington, and some of these conversations, I'm sure, are taking place right now. But using that power to talk to your local member of Congress, talk to your local elected officials, even at the state level, state representatives, state senators, not necessarily ECA reform isn't on their plate directly, but there is this sustained dialogue. And so I think sometimes we forget about the fact that this grassroots effort can play a big deal. And so, hey, I employ 100 people in your jurisdiction. That's meaningful.
Right.
And so that's a very important voice. And so I would encourage businesses to use that, take advantage of that.
Great. Good. Thank you. Genevieve, I'd like to close out with you and see if you could, offer us again, sort of a synopsis of what modernization of the ECA entails and, why it's so important to a prosperous economy as we go forward into 2022. Sure.
Also, I'll give the very short version, right? The ECA is a very old statute with lots of room for improvement and clarity. It is I think Rachel used the sort of plumbing analogy, but really it is sort of the basic skeletal structure of how we elect presidents. And it just it's due for an update, right? It's been a long time. There are some very technical fixes that can be made with large impact to really shore up the way that we elect presidents, adding not just stability, but confidence, across the board in our elections. And all of that translates into a better world for business and for our democracy more broadly. And, like I said, this is something that has broad support across ideologies, and I think prospects in Congress. And so just to pick up on what Trey said, although this is very technical and whatnot, there really is a good argument to be made for businesses to get involved here. And there's more than one way to do that. That could be very public or could be very private. So speaking up in public, helping to build the public case and make clear that there really is support out there for this, or private conversations with your congressperson or your senator. We encourage folks to get involved, and we're happy to have more conversations offline if folks are interested in a more wonky version of the substance and how we can fix this.
Okay, great. Good. Thank you. Well, thank Trey, Genevieve, and Rachel. Thanks so much for your time and all the participants. If you're interested in learning more, please contact us at Business for America. I'm Richard at bfa.us, and we'll continue to hold these webinars and educational forums, in the fall and in the spring. We'll be keeping track of the ECA and hope there's an opportunity to engage with all of you in the coming months. Thank you all.